Hey, hello guys, and welcome back to my Cold War Stories lectures. And today, in our eighth lecture, I am going to talk about the removal of Comrade Nikita Khrushchev and the beginning of the Brezhnev Era from 1964 to 1982. So, in order to understand why Khrushchev was removed from power or what led to his downfall, we have to go back all the way to the Caribbean crisis of 1962. So, following the removal of, or during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev was given a bunch of huge risks, like this big decisions about the missiles in Cuba because the United States told the Soviets under Khrushchev multiple times, take the missiles out of Cuba, take the missiles out of Cuba. They told the Soviet Union multiple times to remove missiles out of Cuba. And so the Soviet Union didn't listen, but Soviet Union told the United States that the missiles in Cuba are only for defense, and they were not meant to not are not planning to attack the United States with the nukes. And so during this time, it was on October 27th of 1962, Khrushchev made an announcement on television, public television, or the Moscow or Moscow Radio, which was the name of the radio station, the Radio Moscow. That was the name of the name that gave the public announcement about the removing missiles out of Cuba. And so Soviets took missiles out of Cuba, and so that led to, and so a lot of people in government, government officials of Communist Party, also known as Politburo, saw Khrushchev as a weak figure in Soviet government because he made the decision to take missiles out of Cuba. And so they saw him as a very weak person, and they had to do something to get rid of him as fast as they could. And so by October of 1960, by most of 1964 and 1963, he was out of the Soviet Union and touring other countries in Eastern Europe, like East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and a bunch of other communist Eastern Bloc countries during that time, because the East was under communist rule. And so he toured East Germany and Czechoslovakia, and those were the two only communist nations they toured at the time. Then those were the only information that I found during that period. And so it was by the spring of 1964, from what I recall correctly, it was Soviet comrade Leonid Brezhnev started to plan a removal to get rid of Khrushchev as fast as they could. And so this Brezhnev started to talk to this other members of the Politburo. Brezhnev was the chairman of the Supreme Soviet. He wasn't the general secretary yet. He would become general secretary of Communist Party of Soviet Union on October 14th, 1964, following the removal of Comrade Nikita Khrushchev on that same day. And so the members of the Politburo agreed to get rid of Khrushchev as fast as they could. And so it was in October of 1964, Khrushchev got a phone call while he was in Pitsanda, Georgia, which is a small town located in the which was known as the Soviet Georgia. It was known as the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic, which was one of the 15 former republics of Soviet Union. And so during that time, he got a phone call from the Soviet government, telling him he needs to come back to the Moscow to deal with this agriculture issues in the Soviet Union. And so he traveled back to Moscow, and he was escorted by some KGB security, and he was escorted back to Kremlin. And so following this, Brezhnev removed the Khrushchev from power, and Brezhnev sent Khrushchev into peaceful retirement. He wasn't killed. He was removed from power peacefully, and he was sent into peaceful retirement. And so, following this, Comrade Brezhnev was elected the first secretary of Communist Party of USSR, together with Alexei Kosygin, who was elected as the premier of the premier of Soviet Union from 1964 all the way until his death in 1980. In December of 1980, Alexei Kosygin held the office as Premier of USSR from 1964 all the way to 1980, and he was the Premier for 16 years, and Brezhnev was the first secretary, or later on General Secretary of the Communist Party of USSR from 1964 to 1982. That meant he was president or leader of USSR for almost 20 years. Can you believe that? 20 years, so 2 decades he was in power. So he was the longest person to be in power after Joseph Stalin was, because Stalin was dictator of USSR for 30 years, from 1924 to 1953. And so Khrushchev wasn't in power for a long time. He was in power for 11 years, from 1953, the time when Joseph Stalin died, and he was removed from power in 1964 following the time when Brezhnev took over from Khrushchev. And Khrushchev lived the rest of his life in peaceful retirement, writing his memories about World War II, his memories as a Soviet soldier in World War II, and his memories as leader of the Soviet Union. So the beginning of Brezhnev era started kind of quietly, because nothing big happened. Like, no one was like getting killed under the Stalin era. So life under Stalin was kind of crazy. It was out of whack. And so Khrushchev time, it started to improve. It started to kind of improve a little. It kind of improved a little. And so under the Brezhnev era, things started to improve. And then after Brezhnev, everything went to crap because of the corruption going on. But I'm going to talk about that in my upcoming lecture soon. So Brezhnev time was kind of long. It lasted for 20 years, almost 20 years, from 1964 to 1982. And so he was leader for 18 years as General Secretary of Communist Party of the USSR. And so during his time, it was kind of peaceful, because there was a time in 1968. That was when Czechoslovakia was invaded by the Soviet Union, because Czechoslovakia wanted to leave the USSR, or the Eastern Bloc, because they wanted to become allies with the United States. And so Soviet Union did not agree to this. Soviet Union did not allow Czechoslovakia to do this, because once you're a part of the Eastern Bloc countries, or Eastern Europe, that's it. You can't leave the Eastern Bloc country, because that was a law. If you lived in Eastern communist countries, you can't leave. That was it. That was the law. You can't go anywhere to the east, to the west, which was capitalism. That was a rule in the Eastern Bloc countries. And so Soviet Union told Czechoslovakia, you can't do this. You can't leave our Eastern Bloc friendship, or whatever. And so that was it. And so Czechoslovakia remained a part of the Soviet Union until 1990, between 1989 and 1990, because that was when most of the communism in Eastern Europe started to fail. And so after this, there was a time in late 70s. That was when oil prices increased, because Soviet Union was making a lot of money by selling oil, and they were making huge bucks by doing that. And there was a lot of stuff on the grocery stores, because there was a lot of stuff on the grocery stores, and there was a lot of food, drinks, and stuff. So life was pretty deep. Life was okay. It was not the best at the time, but going forward, it started to turn crap towards the end of his rule. And so, and during the during 70s, there was the late 70s. That was the time when he started to get really old, and he started getting ridiculous because like people were thinking like he was totally incapable of not running the country because a bunch of other people were ruling the country for him. Like a bunch of other government officials in Soviet government would be taking over from him, like Dmitry Ustinov, who was the Minister of Defense. Andropov was the chairman of the KGB. He was like the chief of the police. And it was Andrei Gromyko, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And I think that was it. So there was those three, and Mikhail Suslova. So these four men governed the country while Brezhnev was sick in late 70s and early 80s. And so during that time, Brezhnev gave a speech. It was in 1980s during there was the Summer Olympics in Moscow going on, and so Brezhnev gave a speech, and he saw the Olympic symbols, and he started to read the paper, and he said, "Oh, oh, oh," and then another Soviet comrade went behind him, and he patted him on the back, and he said, "Comrade Brezhnev, Comrade Brezhnev. Those are not O's, those are Olympic symbols, so you don't have to read them out loud." So those were one of the jokes under the Brezhnev era when Brezhnev was general secretary of the party during his 20-year term as leader of the USSR. And so he was and so a lot of people in Russia right now, a lot of people in Russia think he was a great leader, and even people during the Soviet era think he was a great leader because of the oil prices I said earlier increased. That was 1973, I think that was. That was when the oil prices increased, and then it was by 1979 the oil prices dropped. They decreased because the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in December of 1979. But I'm going to talk about that going forward into my other lectures. And I'm going to talk about the detente, Nixon, Brezhnev, and Carter, all in my upcoming lectures. So I hope you guys enjoyed this lecture, and I'll see you guys in our next lecture where we will be talking about the Nixon, the Brezhnev, and Carter, and the detente era and the SALT agreement in my next lecture. So thank you very much for watching.